Israel is not Israel. The Zionists steal everything, from property to food. The Zionist occupation of Palestine, that calls itself Israel, is built on lies and theft, among other acts of evil. The very name Israel has been stolen and misappropriated for the purpose of deceiving the world. The name originates from the Old Testament of the Christian Bible. The patriarch Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, was renamed Israel, and his descendants became known as the Israelites, of which there were 12 tribes. This was the 19th century BC in the Levant, during the time of the ancient world, where most cultures practiced polytheism. The Israelites, however, were monotheistic and had a good understanding of the one true God, who had designated the prophets to guide them, establishing a series of covenants or divine contracts. Those who accepted and respected the laws of the agreement were considered part of the house of God, or Israel, also referred to as the Church of the Desert, while those who rejected these forfeited their privileges and fell outside of divine providence. Over the next 1800 years, these covenants were broken many times, until the final one was made with the arrival of Jesus. Once again, those who accepted the covenant that God had presented to man through Christ were grafted into the house of God, which became known as the Christian Church, established by Jesus and his apostles at Pentecost, long before the New Testament had been written, completed, and canonized. As previously, those who rejected the covenant were deprived of salvation. The most outspoken rejectors of Jesus were, of course, the Jews, whom eventually had him crucified. Many Jews did, however, accept Christ as the Messiah, and therefore entered into the new covenant. Thus they became known as Christians. No, there is no such thing as a Messianic Jew. That is a fraudulent expression for a Jew who wants to retain his privileges whilst LARPing as a Christian. In the New Testament, the word Jew is a pejorative, referring to those who explicitly rejected Christ in favor of Barabbas, the criminal whom they wanted freed when given the choice by the Romans, honoring a tradition that allowed the residents of Judea to request the release of a prisoner of their choice. The Romans, reluctant to imprison Jesus of Nazareth for lack of any kind of wrongdoing, presented the Judeans with this choice, but they insisted on punishing Jesus for what they perceived as blasphemy, demanding his crucifixion. Many people prefer to use the less sensitive word Pharisee in order to avoid unwanted accusations of so-called anti-Semitism. So through Christ, God opened up Israel to everyone. Israel never changed. It simply became available to all of mankind. Not that it was necessarily closed to those outside of the 12 tribes. The only difference was spreading the word through evangelism was not part of God's plan at the time. Therefore, there was no effort to bring outsiders in. This, however, changed, and Jesus told his apostles to spread the word to all of humanity for the purpose of saving as many souls as possible. One can compare this to a vine of continuity, with Gentiles being grafted into the house of Israel, more commonly referred to as the Christian Church. The true Israel is the Church. It is not a birthright. One's blood does not make one chosen. There's no such thing as DNA privilege. That would imply biological determinism, and therefore denying free will. The whole point of joining the Church is to follow the moral law using free will that was endowed to man by the Creator. If we are to believe that simply belonging to a certain bloodline automatically provides spiritual redemption or some kind of divine privilege, then a covenant means nothing, as there is no requirement to control one's behavior. Entering the kingdom of heaven requires effort amid temptation. A covenant, like any contract, has terms and conditions which must be adhered to, lest the contract be rendered null and void. This is the fundamental mistake that many people, especially Christian Zionists, make. They completely ignore something so obvious that it's clear they are under demonic deception. The idea that the Jews of today are somehow still in contract with God from the Old Covenant with Abraham is truly absurd when some simple questions are asked, such as, how do we know they are actual descendants of Abraham? Is their behavior irrelevant? A contract requires both parties to respect the conditions. Yes, God never breaks his promise. This is always a go-to statement for Christian Zionists. The rebuttal to this is simple. Yes, absolutely God keeps his word, but man does not. So it's not God who broke the covenant. It was the Israelites. For a contract to be valid, both parties must respect the terms, which were in turn broken again and again. And this brings us back to Jesus, the Messiah, and the Logos incarnate. This idea of the Jews of today somehow being God's chosen people can easily be debunked. As mentioned, it was never a birthright. There is no such thing as divine DNA. This idea can perhaps be associated with the reformer John Calvin and his theology of predestination, also known as biological determinism, a completely heretical and unchristian belief. Calvinist theology claims that God has already chosen our path for us, and thus our future is already set, no matter what choices we make. This begs the question, do we even have free will? And does our behavior even matter? If not, then what determines our fate? All that remains is our physical body, our flesh and blood. This notion opened the door to many new ideas, leading to the Enlightenment, the philosophy of naive empiricism, and of course, Darwinian theory, where man is nothing but an animal, solely driven by his pre-programmed instincts for survival. In the preceding centuries after the Reformation, many new self-proclaimed Christians remained believers, but then applied predestination to their own version of biblical scriptures, inventing their own theology without guidance from the church, leading to various denominations, each with their own model of Christianity. This also presupposes that there is genetic continuity between today's Jews and the ancient Israelites, which is impossible to accurately assert as fact. And again, it removes behavior from the equation. So even if it could be proven, it's completely irrelevant. Fast forward to 1948, and the Zionists establish their so-called state under the co-opted name of Israel. They stole the name, plain and simple. They stole this name for the purpose of misleading their largest support base of evangelicals, mainly in the USA, and also to satisfy the religious Jews within the Zionist movement, of which there are many, contrary to popular belief. Zionism came out of Judaism. It has been the desire of many Jews for centuries, long before Theodor Herzl, to restore their ancient state. Rabbis such as Moses Hess and his book Rome and Jerusalem advocated for a Jewish state that would act as an alliance between secular and religious Jews alike. The only Christians who supported Zionism were not truly Christian, strictly speaking. It was religious fanatics in the Puritan circles who fostered and adopted this idea, starting in 17th century England. The Reformation of the 16th century is what opened the door to religious cults and sects that could easily masquerade as Christians. And so they did, gathering support, with charismatic types able to build up large followings, with misinterpretations that went unchecked, but fooled many, and continue doing so to this day. So within just a few centuries, the Jews, whom everyone knew the truth about, had slowly managed to convince society that they were not only not to be suspicious of, but were in fact the Hebrews or Israelites of the Old Testament, and therefore the people of the book. For 15 centuries, the Church stood firm and unified, acting as a bulwark against the anti-Christians. But when the Church was divided and Christendom split, everything changed. A new schism took place, but there was no unity, no centrality, and no universalism. The very nature of Protestantism was schismatic, and thus began an endless division and creation of various denominations. Many became Judaized until they merged with actual Judaism, both desiring to witness the arrival of their respective messiahs. They became aligned and soon found themselves working for a common cause, the restoration of ancient Judea, or King David's Kingdom of Israel, thinking this would somehow accelerate the end times, as if man can force God's hand. So, we have a sect that call themselves Christians, another sect that call themselves God's chosen people, and a military occupation that calls itself Israel, all of which are incorrect and outright lies. These evangelicals are not Christians, the chosen people are not chosen, and Israel is not Israel. The true Israel is not some territory in the Levant. It isn't soil, it's not rocks, and it's not trees. It's not a physical location. Israel is a spiritual fellowship of people with faith who follow Jesus of Nazareth and his teachings. The Zionist occupation of Palestine, that has named itself Israel since 1948, is nothing but a Jewish military dictatorship. It has been masquerading as a country and has fooled not only religious fanatics into believing that it is a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, but also the secular masses of the Western world who were victims of the most extensive and elaborate lie in human history, making them sympathetic to the cause. With complete control over the media and Hollywood programming, the truth was hidden for decades, the masses kept in blissful ignorance, and the few voices of reason silenced or imprisoned. Just because a name is applied to something does not make it so. An individual can choose any name for himself. He could call himself Jesus, but this does not make him the Messiah. Many Muslims choose the name Muhammad, but they never claim to be the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. A perfectly drawn dollar bill may look real, but it is still a counterfeit.